Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I'm excited to share October Clubs for Spellbinders. So this here is the clear stamp of the month, and there's the matching dies to go with it. We also have the glimmer of the month, some really cute Christmas lights, as well as a Merry Christmas sentiment and die to go with it. Then there is the stencil of the month. There's two different layering stencils in here, one to create a pattern background and then one layering stencil to create the ornaments. So you get two different backgrounds in one here, which is fantastic. I love the fact that there is two. Both of them will work for Christmas, but that just all over background, you could use that any time of the year too. Then we have our small die of the month as well as our large die of the month. So this is part one of the October Clubs videos that I'm going to do. I'm going to do another one where I use specifically the clear stamp as well as the stencil again, and probably the glimmer plate again. This video, I'm going to be using many of the different elements, but I'm focusing on the large die of the month, the small die of the month, as well as the glimmer of the month. So first thing I'm going to do is create a pattern background. I have some Hammermill cardstock here and some Spellbinders ink blending brushes. And I'm using distress inks in Salvaged Patina as well as Evergreen Bough. Now it's coming onto the cardstock a little bit more green than I had originally envisioned, but that's okay. The colors that I'm inspired by are from the Oh Joyful Day printed papers from the card making kit, and I've done a video recently with it, and there's a little bit of green in there, so this still will work as well. If it didn't, I would have just redone it, but there are some areas that are a little bit more green, and then there's some areas that are a little bit on the teal or turquoise side that will go well with that. So I have a bunch of the pieces from the large die of the month cut out already. I want to cut the pajama pants out of this plaid paper, and this one is from that Oh Joyful Day printed paper pad. I love the colors in this kit, and I tend to go in phases where I like to work with different color palettes, and I had just done a video with this kit and really loved the teals and turquoises with the crimson and pink. Pink is one of those colors that I don't naturally use for Christmas things, but I love the fact that this kind of forced me to include it, and I really love the look when I see it. So I thought this plaid one here would be perfect for pajama pants, but as I flip through that paper pack, there's so many good ones that would be perfect for this as well. So this paper isn't very thick. So in order to give it a little bit more thickness, I just added some inexpensive white cardstock behind it. It doesn't need to be anything special, but I didn't want to be able to see the pattern from my background through that plaid, which is why I did this. If you have some printed paper or if you're using some solid cardstock and it's thick enough, you don't need to do that step. But like I said, I wanted to make sure that that was completely opaque and I wasn't going to be able to see underneath it. For the sentiment, there's already a sentiment in this set, and I cut it out of Waterfall Cardstock with the insert with the sentiment, and then I also cut it out of Crimson Cardstock with just the outline. So you can see that the sentiment itself is that turquoise color, but then the letters have that crimson color to it, so it shows them off a little bit more. When I was doing my die cutting, there's this one little piece here that I'm coloring with a black Copic, and I didn't know what in the world it was for until I started basically really looking at the pieces, and I realized that it was likely the piece to go behind the eyes, or at least that's what I'm assuming. I can be corrected if I'm wrong. I couldn't think of anything else it would work for. I already had them cut out of white because the other piece on that same die, I wanted that out of white. So rather than go back and cut it out of black cardstock, I just took a black Copic marker and colored them. It's going to look exactly the same. I did the Copic marker because it's permanent. So when I use the glue and when I'm use what I'm going to use later to add some shine to it, it's not going to rehydrate the ink anyway or make it spread. If you do that with some black marker, I wouldn't do the step that I do at the end because it's going to rehydrate that ink and it might start to bleed into the brown. A lot of these pieces that I die cut for these are done out of cardstock scraps, and that's what's great about die cut sets that have a lot of pieces like this. They're a great way to use up those cardstock scraps. This particular set here, I'm doing the reindeer slippers for it, but there's a bunch of different ones. There's penguin, Santa, like dinosaur feet. So it's really fun that you can pick and mat or pick and choose which one you want. There's also a little Santa hat to go with it. So there's a lot of different options and you can get creative and just have fun with it. So the pink that I'm using for under the ears is Pink Sand Spellbinders Cardstock. The browns that I'm using are just cardstock scraps that I have in my scrap bins. I don't have any brown Spellbinders cardstocks yet, so I just use some scraps that I already had on hand. Obviously, the white dot behind the nose was a scrap of white that I had. I keep a ton of different scraps and tend to use them for things like this, so they work out perfect. The little slippers are done out of Waterfall Cardstock. And like I said before, the colors that I'm using with my die cuts here are all inspired from the color palette in that Oh Joyful Day printed paper pad. And that's a great way to get a color palette, especially one that you may not necessarily gravitate to in the first place. That piece there is just a little leg piece and it's die cut out of Barely Peach cardstock. Perfect for that. You could also do it out of a colored cardstock and pretend it's a sock if you wanted. I'm gluing everything together with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle that has a really fine tip to it. So it's perfect for all of these tiny little die cuts, as well as gluing my cards together while I'm waiting for things to dry or waiting for the glue to set and gluing other pieces. I have a large acrylic block that I always put on top of my pieces. It just holds everything flat, makes sure things stay where they're supposed to be, and it also frees up my hands to be working on other things. I don't like sitting and waiting for glue to dry, so it's perfect for that. I can put my acrylic block on there, know that everything is held flat, and then work on the next step. And you can see that it comes together really, really easily. The thing that takes the longest is doing any of that die cutting. But really, you can just put a movie on or a TV show on, do a little bit of die cutting, have everything ready. I always do my die cutting and put them in those medium craft stacks so everything is together, ready, waiting. And when I'm putting them into the medium craft stacks, I will typically put things together that go together. So I'll put all the pieces for the deer together for this one. I'll put all the pieces for the legs and the pajama pants together. So it comes together really, really easily because I have all of my pieces that go together. I'm just using white card bases for my set here, or for my cards here, and I thought it would be great to stamp the inside of the card with some of the sentiments from the clear stamp of the month. I haven't used this set yet, so I'm taking a white eraser and I'm using it on the stamping surface of the stamp. This removes any manufacturing residue and makes sure that that ink is going to take really well to the stamp. I do this especially with clear stamps. Rubber stamps, you may or may not need to do it, but if you have a stamp that is just not taking the ink well, try this, see if that helps. Often it does. I use a white eraser. You could also rub it against a t-shirt or some jeans, something that has just a little bit of texture to it that can rub any of that residue off there. I started using the Salvaged Patina for the inside for that stamping, but it was a little bit more light than I wanted it to be, so I went in with a second stamping using that Evergreen Bough. I chose the Waterfall Cardstock as a matte here, just to keep it very, very subtle, but you could also use that Crimson Cardstock if you wanted it to be a little bit more prominent. That would work as well. This piece is cut to 4 1/8 inch by 5 3/8 inch, and my pattern piece that we use the stencil on is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So you're seeing very, very little of that turquoise matte on there, or that waterfall matte on there. I wanted the focal point to be on the legs and the slippers and be able to see as much of that as possible. And I also wanted to make sure that you could see a decent amount of the background behind it. Now the legs of the pajama pants are a little bit higher than my printed background here. So I'm going to glue these pieces on here first, let the glue set for just a little bit, and then I'm going to trim it off because I didn't want it going to the top of the card, although you could easily do this. The other thing I wanted to mention is I have it so that my little pajama pants there are flared out at the bottom. If you wanted, you could easily swap it and have it the other way. I think it works either way, and it's perfect that you can pick and choose what you want. Now, because I used a plaid, I tried to make sure that the plaid was kind of as even as possible, the stripes across as possible. They're definitely not perfect and not completely even all the way across. If you have an all over pattern, you wouldn't have to worry about this at all, but it's one of those things that I kind of like it when it looks fairly similar, fairly even across. Next, I added my sentiment to it. And then the last step for this card is I'm taking some glossy accents. I have a nice fine tip on my glossy accents, and I'm using it on the eyes of the slipper as well as the nose to give it some shine and just to give it a little bit of extra texture. Even though we have the plaid and the stenciled background and the cardstock, it's all got a matte finish to it, so there's not a lot of texture to it. So by adding the glossy accents, it adds that texture and just gives it a little bit of a different look, just kind of elevates it a little bit. For my next card, I'm using the small die of the month. This one is an adorable bear with penguin and lights wrapped around the bear. It's almost like the penguin is decorating the bear as a Christmas tree with that little star on top. I'm going to use the same color palette that I used with the first one, and I'm using one of the pattern papers as my background. I'm not going to glue anything to the background quite yet, but I figured I might as well take those papers in my card base, glue them down, and have it ready to go. Now, I wanted my lights to really sparkle and shine, so I'm using some gold holographic. Really, it's the solid hot foiling. When I do foiling with my glimmer machine, I will regularly do the solid hot foiling. Sometimes I use these as mats around my cards. Sometimes I use them as images on the front of my cards. Sometimes I just use them to die cut pieces out of. So that's what I did here. This was a piece that I knew I was never going to use on the front of a card. So I used it to die cut those lights out of, and they look fantastic at the end. So if you have some solid hot foiled pieces that you're not necessarily going to be using for a card image, this works absolutely perfect for this. So for the bear's sweater, I used one more of those printed papers from the Oh Joyful Day printed paper pad. I used some crimson cardstock for the collar. My bear is cut out of white cardstock, and then I have fog, which is the light gray cardstock for the ears and the little nose piece, pink sand for the cheeks, and then obviously black for the nose and then the little eye piece that goes behind it. Once again, you can see how easy everything goes together because everything is all die cut together or die cut out and ready to go. For my penguin, I have just some black cardstock, some white cardstock, and then the orange accents are done out of persimmon cardstock. Again, all scraps that I had in my little scrap bin for doing this in particular. Now, I absolutely love both of these little characters together, so I decided to use them both, but you could easily just use the bear if you wanted, or just use the penguin. I think it would be adorable to have each one of them separate as well. It would also be cute to have the bear on the front and take this penguin and put it inside the card. I think that would be cute as well. The penguin has a little Santa hat, and to add just a tiny little bit of texture, I went and I took some white glitter cardstock and die cut the rim as well as the little pom-pom that goes on the end out of that gold cardstock, white glitter cardstock. If you don't have white glitter cardstock, you could also just use white cardstock, and then once your card is assembled, put some stickles on top of it to add that glitter element to it. It just adds a little bit of extra sparkle and a little bit of extra texture to it. This little black piece here has the star on top, and it just goes behind the little bear's head. And the lights are really easy to put together. There's two different sizes. There's a smaller size as well as a bigger size. Again, I have them sitting in my medium craft stacks, and I just put a dot of glue on the bulb part of the light string, use a jewel picker to pick those pieces up and place them on that light string, and then I'll set that aside to dry. I do take my hand and use them to flip all those die cuts over. Sometimes I try to use the jewel picker to flip the die cuts over, and I find it's more frustrating than anything. So it's much easier to use my hands to just flip them over to make sure that they're right side up. Even just on its own, without or before the card's finished, I love the light and the shine and the shimmer that's coming off these lights. It almost makes them look like they're twinkling lights, and I love that. Now, I did them in that gold holographic. Obviously, they'll work with whatever color, and the nice thing about using solid hot foiled images is you don't necessarily need to go out and get a whole bunch of different metallic cardstocks. They're perfect for using for things like this, and foil comes in so many different colors, or at least I have it in so many different colors, so it's a perfect use for it. So for the inside of this card, once again, I'm going to use another one of those sentiments from that clear Stamp of the Month set. I like all the different sentiments for it, and when I go to create my next video where I'm going to be using that stamp set and creating cards, I'm not going to be able to use all of them on one card, so I figured this is the perfect way to do it, and the sentiments work with these cards as well. So now that all my main pieces here are all ready to go, I can start gluing them on the front of the cards. Now I am making sure not to put my glue around the outside of these die cuts because I want to just kind of tuck the edges in. So for this light here, or this light string, I want to make sure to tuck in the end piece. So by not having glue on that area there, I can make sure that it's really easy to just lift that up and tuck it in. Now I am keeping the same layout as on the front of this die set, so I'm not changing the layout in any way, but you could probably do that. I just really liked the layout, and I really wanted to play with it the way that it was, or the way that they had intended it on there, but I think it would be adorable changed up as well. So I'm making sure to do the first, or to glue down the die cuts that get tucked behind the bear first, so that that glue doesn't dry too much and I can't tuck it down as much. The little penguin goes on top of the bear's head. And then I'm going to do the small light set. I did 2 of the larger light strings and then just 1 of the smaller, but you could add more if you wanted there to be more lights here. And I think it would also be fun to do some extra light strings and just kind of have them on the inside of the card as an extra element. So this is the secret to making the lights pop. Once again, I'm pulling out those glossy accents. I'm going to put them on the eyes of the little bear and the penguin, but I'm also putting them on those lights. And I'm being fairly generous when I'm putting them on the lights. It's going to take extra time for it to dry, but it's going to give those lights some extra shine and extra dimension. And because that foil is holographic cardstock, it really looks cool on them like that. I don't think the camera shows off how fantastic those lights look when they're done, and you could just put a thin coat on them if you want, but I really wanted them to have as much curved dimension as possible. So I was very generous with it, but not so much that it was excess wood and would like seep off of those die cuts. I made sure that there was just enough to stay on there. So once those are dry, you could see how beautiful they looked. I set them to aside and then started working on my third card here. So here I'm using the Glimmer of the Month. I love this background with the holiday lights. It only does about half of the background, so I'm going to do this in 2 phases. I'm using the speckled Aura Glimmer foil that comes with the Glimmer of the Month. It coordinates beautifully with the Aura Glimmer foil solid pieces that I used with the last card, so that is absolutely perfect. I have my foil cut to smaller pieces that just are the size of that glimmer plate. If I were to use a piece that was as big as the cardstock, there's a very good chance I'm going to get a whole lot of overfoiling. So by doing it this way, I can avoid that as much as possible. Now, to make sure that my plate was placed properly, I kind of use my fingers at the bottom of the first pattern that I used before placing it down on that background. There's a little bit more of a wider strip than I had intended, but that's okay. That's going to be where I put my sentiment. I'm also going to put my sentiment on some crimson cardstock. I want to make sure that it pops up off that background, and I did tape that in place with some Best Ever craft tape just to avoid any overfoiling and to make sure that that plate didn't shift on there. Now, even though I have this background here done with 2 different foils, I am going to still do my solid hot foiling. I'm not going to be using it for this card. It's going to be likely used to do some more die cutting with in between all of the little holiday lights. Now, that solid part from my sentiment, I could solid hot foil it, but I chose not to. I don't think I'm going to be using it in that way, so I just chose not to do the solid hot foiling for this. So here is the final result, and you can see how that would be just too much for a background, but I think it would be cool to do some die cutting with. You could also use it, again, for a mat around something that would work as well. Now, even though I was trying to avoid overfoiling, I did have a little bit of it on some of the lights, especially towards the edge. So the first way I'm going to try to remove them is I have a piece of Best Ever craft tape. I put it on my t-shirt a couple times to take some of the excess stick out of it, and then I'm putting it on the background and then just peeling it up. Now, when you first start doing this, you need to make sure to be very careful because you don't want that tape to stick to your background and then rip it. As you get used to how sticky that tape is, you could be a little bit more aggressive with it because as you're using it, it's losing some of that tape as well. But you can see how it picked up a bunch of that excess foiling. Anything over that wasn't removed, I'm just using a Tombow sand eraser for that, just to clean it up a little bit. It doesn't need to be perfect for what I'm doing. And then, like I said before, this edge here is going to be where I'm putting my sentiment as well. So a lot of this is likely going to be hid, but I don't know how much, so I want to try clean it up as much as possible. Before I start to work on that background a little bit more, I'm taking the die from the sentiment, I'm taping it in place, and I'm going to die cut it. It did shift over a tiny little bit while I was die cutting, but that's okay. I still have the full sentiment. It's just not quite centered as much as I would like. I'm also going to take, and I do this off screen, some cardstock scraps from that crimson cardstock and die cut that a couple more times so that I can give that background a little bit of extra dimension. To go behind this piece here, I'm using some Waterfall Cardstock. Once again, cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. And then my foiled background here, I have that cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. Now, to enhance my background here, I'm using 2 different Copic markers. I have BG15, which is the tealy turquoise color, and then I have R37. So I'm coloring in the lights and I'm going to kind of alternate between the blue and the red. Once again, this is the colors that coordinate with the Oh Joyful Day printed paper pad and my previous cards. But you could do this in any color that you want. Now, the one thing to note is these are alcohol markers, so they are going to color over the foil. So there's a little kind of shine spot in that light, and I am coloring over that. But I am trying to keep away from the edges of my lights. I'm trying not to go over top of that at all. I want to make sure that those are the gold speckled aura color. Once I have done that blue color, I'm going to go in and do the same thing with my red. And the red is a nice dark red, very similar to the crimson. Now, I chose to use alcohol markers for this because I'm going to go over it with glossy accents. When you use alcohol markers and put glossy accents over top of it, that ink is not going to run. You could use dye-based markers to color these in, and that little shine spot in the lights would resist the dye-based markers because it can't color over it. But the reason I chose not to use dye-based markers for this is when you use glossy accents, especially over dark reds, often they'll kind of turn pinky. And I didn't want to chance the colors changing. And I also didn't want to chance them running and bleeding too much. Now it is going to run and bleed within that glossy accent, so you don't have to worry about it bleeding outside of it. But the main reason is because the reds and pink, or the reds, especially the darker reds, tend to turn a little bit pinky, and I didn't want them to change color that much. So by having the glossy accents over alcohol markers, and it could be any alcohol markers that would work, I can ensure that that color is going to stay the same that I colored it. So I am taking the glossy accents, I'm going all the way around the lights, and then I'm flooding it in. It's kind of like icing a cookie. I like to do the outside edge, and then I flood in between there. And just like the lights before, if you use a lot, it's going to be more domed than if you just do a thin coat of it. It's really personal preference. But look at that final result. Those colors and that glossy accents really take that background up a level. And I love the dimension that you get with it, as well as the shine. Next, I'm going to take my sentiment, glue those extra die cut pieces to the back of it. This is just going to give it some easy dimension. And because I have those glossy accent lights on my card here, when I go to glue this down, it's going to be just fine over top of that. I don't have to worry about that extra dimension and worry about my sentiment warping at all. It's going to hold up because I have the strength of those extra die cuts behind them. And I'm still using that Barely Art glue to glue all of this together. You can see how because that sentiment is red, it really pops off. I think if it was done on white cardstock, it wouldn't really pop off that background quite as much. And I absolutely love the speckle from that speckle aura foil. It really catches the light beautifully. So here are the 3 cards for this video. I will be back soon with a part 2 with using some of the other products for another video. Thank you so much for joining me for part 1 of Spellbinders October Clubs. I can't wait to see you in the next video for part 2. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the time you spend with me. Have a fantastic day.